Today's ship chat is a request by Navark Tully DT. If you want to support the channel, then consider becoming a channel member. If you enjoyed the new Nova episode and you want to see more of the brand new Nova model, then consider joining at the Centurion tier and you'll get access to all the various schematics and some of the artwork that I've created using this new model. Thank you very much. Right, so today we're going to be talking about a D7. Emphasis there is on a D7 because there are many. In this particular instance, we're looking at the Romulan D7, the D7 Stormbird, or V-11 Stormbird as they called it. So we'll get into it. So behind the scenes, in terms of actual production, so the main reason that this even exists is because obviously they'd written the Enterprise incident, they were going to do that episode, and then it got round to doing the model shots. And what they very quickly realised was that the Bird of Prey model, the Tallis, wasn't really up to scratch for the kind of shots they wanted from it. You know, it's a wood-carved model, and to be frank, compared to the D7 and Enterprise models, which are, you know, reasonably interesting shapes, the Bird of Prey model is very simplistic and, you know, wouldn't stand up to the best scrutiny on camera. That's why they used the D7. It had also only been used so far in Elan of Troyes in original series, i.e. prior to the remaster. So that meant that it was kind of up in the air as to what the D7 was and who ran it. So, you know, you could play a little bit fast and loose. But in the episode, there was no kind of retcon. They just said, oh, it's a Klingon ship. I think they realised that, you know, people would have paid enough attention in Elan of Troyes to say, hang on a minute, you know. So they go and they, you know, acknowledge in dialogue, wait, those are Klingon ships. And that brings about the whole idea of the Klingon-Romulan alliance, which, you know, is interesting that essentially that entire plot thread is largely a result of production necessities. It's just that they wanted to use a different model. And then, you know, we've come up with this whole, you know, lore about how there was a Klingon-Romulan alliance in the 60s, which I stand by. It's just interesting how that was all just from, you know, simple pragmatism when it came to producing the series. It didn't actually have the Bird of Prey emblem until the remaster. Then they superimposed it on with the CG model, but the original was just a plain old D7. And then since then, it's just taken on a life of its own. People have produced all sorts of artwork based on the Stormbirds. There's also a lot of kind of derivatives and design studies that have been generated from it, both by the fandom and also by people who were contracted out to do, you know, secondary material. So, for example, I think there's one which basically has a double hull design. It's basically a D7 with a second set of wings at the bottom. I think that's a Romulan dreadnought. It was also featured in the animated series as well, although, you know, not that anyone's going to remember that. But, you know, that's essentially the main history of the Romulan Stormbird. Right, so we'll get into it in universe now. So, essentially, after the Balance of Terror, the Romulans need modern starships. They realise that the Tallis isn't up to scratch. They don't really have starships, aside from the Gallant Wing, which is quite defensive. They don't really have any starships that are built for ship-to-ship combat. And certainly not that kind of direct confrontation. The Gallant Wing is still a hit-and-run type craft. So this is what kind of leads them to an alliance with the Klingons. Now there is also some grand strategy behind this, and I'll probably talk about this more in late 23rd century Romulan doctrine, because it's more applicable there. But essentially they have this alliance with the Klingons that's both strategic and also, you know, they're trading stuff. So the Romulans trade cloaking devices for the D7s, the Klingons trade D7s for the cloaking device. In total, they receive about 60 ships over those few years, because the alliance is actually very short-lived. It falls apart after Galactic Brak, but we'll get there. The Klingons were happy to give up the D7 because they were already planning the Katinga refit. So they were, you know, very confident they were going to stay more than a step ahead of anything that the Romulans were going to do with their D7s, because the Klingons were already working on the Katinga. So, in that way, they were quite happy to give away these, what were sort of aging ships for the time at this point, and, coming up for upgrade and refit. The deliveries then stop after the Battle of Cluck-de-Kel-Brucht in 2271. That's a speculated date. It's somewhere in the 70s. Now, an interesting note on when they were delivered without Klingon disruptors or torpedoes, but they were delivered with the launchers. Now, this comes to a Klingon ploy. You see, the Klingons knew that they had the advantage over pretty much everyone else when it came to torpedo technology. And so they were going to include the torpedo launcher, as I say, look at this nice torpedo launcher, imagine what you could do with it, especially with our brand new high-end, top-of-the-line photon torpedoes that are superior even to what Starfleet has. So that was their plan. They were going to try and sell the Romulans the torpedoes later. Unfortunately, that backfired, and the Romulans just went and managed to reverse engineer their own basic photon torpedoes. Now, that is to say, they were nowhere near up to the standards of Starfleet or Klingon photon torpedoes. They were certainly the weakest link, but they're in the running when they weren't before. They gave the Romulans basically half of what they needed to get a competitive photon torpedo going by giving them the launcher. So basically, in Romulan service, the D7 or V-11 Stormbird becomes a experimental platform. This is a ship that they basically say, okay, this is the act, this is the modern starship, this is, what everyone's crazy about, this is what everyone wants. What can we do with it? How can we play with it? How can we modify it? How can we make it work for us? Are there technologies that are going to work well with this? Are there technologies that won't work so well? Can we, what can we modify? What can we do? So they just go absolutely nuts in modifying and experimenting with their D7s. So in terms of armament, so there's actually 3 different heavy armaments. So that's in the main heavy hardpoint where the torpedo launcher was. So obviously they have proprietary Romulan photon torpedoes. That's one option. Equally, there's some ships where they just ripped out that launcher entirely and either replaced it with a plasma torpedo launcher, like on the Talis, or a forced plasma beam, like on the Thry, all of which were, uniquely Romulan weapons. And, they wanted to really test, were these kind of weapons viable on a modern starship? In terms of the light hardpoints, where the Klingon disruptors, they would experiment with plasma phasers, they would get some black market Klingon disruptors, and develop their own Romulan disruptors, but they were essentially, again, experimenting with different types of weaponry for that hardpoint. They would also modify the engines. They would be swapped out for Romulan engines. The engines, the Klingon nacelles would often be broken up and reverse engineered. And really that just foreshadows what would end up happening to all the Stormbirds by really the 70s. Because, of course, the Klingons come out with the Katinga, the Federation comes out with the Constitution refit, and the Romulans realise very quickly that the D7 is becoming outmatched, it's becoming outmoded, and also it's not really a good look for the Romulans in terms of sort of, prestige and, political image to say that, to see that they are using Klingon ships. It makes them look like a Klingon stooge, rather than being the independent third party that they see themselves as. They see themselves as basically the independent third party, unstable, unpredictable element in the otherwise binary system that exists between the Federation and the Klingons. They see themselves as that third guy in the middle, keeping the other two off balance. So come the 2270s, they were broken up and cannibalized. There were a couple of derivatives. So the main ship that came out during the 70s, not a whole lot of them, were Vituredx class battlecruisers. They're essentially a Romulan rebuild of a D7, but to Romulan style. And you can definitely see that with the double wings, the more central placement of the engines. The Vituredx doesn't last long. It is a bit of a stopgap craft, well, because the main ship that they want to replace is the Thry, and the main ships they're going to replace it with are the Nova, and then subsequently the Firehawk Battlecruiser. And those are the things that are really going to take over the duties of the Thry, and as well as other ships. So the Vituredx doesn't really last long. It sees some use in the 80s, but very quickly just falls out of service because it's very much inferior to the Nova and Firehawk. Fundamentally, what the Vituredx is just a rebuild or modification of some of 2260s technology in the 70s. You know, and it stays competitive in that respect, but, you know, once you start getting into the 80s and, you know, entirely new ships like Nova, like Excelsior, then Vituredx really does start to fall by the wayside. And with that visible D7 influence really kind of disappears out of the Romulan fleet after that. You know, they're very keen to move away from that look because, as they say, it doesn't look good for them. And they want to, you know, really assert themselves independently. And again, the D7 really did not fit in with that. And so that was why it had a pretty comparatively short lifespan. Really only seeing service for about a decade or so, if that, before being broken up out of service. So it was highly influential, but it really didn't last long, you know, and you might say that perhaps the brightest stars burn half as long, or you could say that it just illustrates the relentless, the breakneck march of technology that occurred in the mid-23rd century, obviously all spurred by that Cold War situation. And you can really see what the impact of that is and just how fast technology moves. And it doesn't take very long before you end up being left in the wayside technological development. And that was ultimately the fate of the Stormbird. Thank you guys for watching. I'm just going to do a brief bit of admin here, just to kind of, you know, prime you for future content. So, obviously the next big episode is the Tomed incident. Now, as you guys might expect, as you guys have, I think, have come to expect over the years, normally the way this works is I do like 3 or 4 quote-unquote short form videos like this, and then there's a big one. Now, I'm looking at the Tomed incident. I'm actually planning to do at least 6 short form videos. This is not necessarily because it's necessarily so big or anything like that. It's more that I want to make sure that all the groundwork is there. So we're going to do kind of more stuff that's... So for the first 4 weeks, we're going to be largely kind of filling out some of the stuff we've already covered with, like, Romulan weaponry. So that's the Arsenal episode. We'll also be covering another Romulan ship in a ship chat. We'll also be looking at warp field geometry. That's just because I've had it in my head for so long, and I need to get it out there at this point. I need to get it out there and talk about it now, because it's one of those things I've alluded to a lot, but I have never properly explained. So we need to do that. So that's that. And then we're going to have basically, then there's 2 weeks of videos that are real primers for the Tomed incidents. That's late 23rd century / early 24th century Romulan doctrine, the kind that will be used in Tomed incident. And then just kind of a summary, a breakdown of the astropolitical situation as we find it in the Tomed incident. So how do we get from Star Trek VI to the build-up to the Tomed incident? You know, that's just kind of laying the groundwork, and there'll also be some teasers I'll be releasing as well. So, yeah, that's just the admin. That's just so hopefully you will enjoy all that content. I hope you're looking forward to it, and I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you guys in the next one.